All right, we're going to do our light eaters reading for today. I think we left off on page 80. By the way, I'm not doing this in chronological order because that's not the way I'm doing it. So the last sentence I think I read was, so now he knew that touching a plant could make it shorter, squatter, and more flexible, all incredibly useful ways to avoid getting killed in a world full of wind and inconsiderate animals. Later, the genomics revolution made it possible to see just how impactful touch is to plants on a deeper level. Peering at the genes of Arabidopsis thaliana, a weedy plant in the mustard family, and the lab rat of the plant biology world, researchers saw the touch quite triggered such a dramatic response in their hormones and gene expression that it could substantially inhibit their growth. They stroked the Arabidopsis with soft paintbrushes. The paintbrush is in and of its own plant, by the way. I don't think that's the kind of paintbrush that they mean in this specific terminology. And then analyze the plant's genetic responses. Within 30 minutes of being touched, 10% of the plant's genome was altered. Let me repeat that. Within 30 minutes of being touched, 10% of the plant's genome was altered. It's pretty quick. Pretty quick, indeed. Clearly, the plant was reorganized in its priorities to deal with the disturbance and rerouting energy away from the hard work of getting taller. Touched multiple times, Arabidopsis, I don't know, it's a mouthful, cut its upward growth rate by much as 30%, just as Jaffe had found years before. Remember, Jaffe is Mark. Just remember Jaffe. Jaffe. When touched, a plant will essentially activate the immune system. In this way, human touch has been shown to help plants ward off a future fungal infection because the plant's defenses are already up. Whatever the situation, touch a plant and it will take note, most often by becoming incredibly stressed and defensive. Most plants don't appear bothered when we step on them or pluck a flower, but we now know that they bristle internally with all the force of a startled porcupine or a spooked stallion. Plants are fully aware of our contact with them and will rearrange their lives to respond to such treatment. But how is this feeling possible? How is a touch noted by a plant, and how could it possibly be translated into a response? The answer might involve electricity. Touch a plant or an animal, and its response will show up on a voltmeter. One of the earliest attempts to study electricity in plants was made in the 1900s in Kolkata, India, by a biologist, physicist, botanist, and science fiction writer named Jagadish Chandra Bose, J.C. Bose. As he was known, he was a pioneer of wireless telecommunication, having discovered millimeter-length electromagnetic waves, the microwaves that first made the radios possible, and are used in remote sensing and airport security scanners today. In fact, he built the radio wave receiver used by Guglielmo. It literally says Guglielmo. I know it sounds like I'm saying googly moogly, like googly, but that's what it says. It says Guglielmo, like tickle me Elmo. It's Guglie LMO. Marconi to make the first working radio. Okay, well, let me just, yeah. In fact, he built the radio wave receiver used by Guglielmo Marconi to make the first working radio. He was perhaps the most famous biologist of his generation. He was knighted, elected to the Royal Society, and was the first Indian to hold a United States patent. And yet, outside of South Asia, he had been largely forgotten. In the years following his major breakthrough with microwaves, thinking there might be sort of electrical life to everything, Bose, when I say that, I mean like the Bose speakers. If you ever heard a Bose speaker. Began experiments on vegetables. He attached electric probes to various vegetables and claimed to record a death spasm. That's in quotations, like air quotes, death spasm, which is kind of interesting. Petite mort means orgasm in French, but if you literally translate it, it means little death. It's really weird, awkward. I did not make that up. That's true. And claimed to record a death spasm in the form of a spike in electrical activity. He hooked a cabbage to a voltmeter in front of the playwright George Bernard Shaw, who had reportedly was horrified to witness the electrical convulsion of the cabbage as it was dropped in boiling hot water. Shaw, it must be said, was a vegetarian. Bose also observed how mimosas produced an electrical impulse just before their leaflets closed. English scientist John Burdon Sanderson had first recorded electrical excitations in another sensitive plant, the Venus flytrap, in 1876. Yet he was only looking at the surface of the leaf. Bose went deeper, looking at the electrical response within individual plant cells with a microelectrode recording system he divined himself. Several years before scientists took the first microelectrode recordings of single neurons in animals. Animal testing. They do it with makeup. They do it with shampoo and conditioner products. It's disgusting. Honestly. He watched as the voltage in individual plant cells changed when they were irritated, clearly responding to touch. In 1925, some years later, he wrote about plant nerves and suggested they behave like synapses, which is what we were talking about the other day. Synapses are brain nerves. Yeah. By then, the earliest explanations of the animal nervous system were being published through the world. The word neuron had not been. Okay. By then, the earliest explanations of the plant and animal nervous system were being published through the word neuron that had not yet been coined. Plants, Bose decided, must have nervous systems. He was convinced that electrical impulses were responsible for controlling most plant functions like growth, photosynthesis, movement, and responses to whatever the environment threw their way. Light, heat, exposure to toxins. The result of the investigation, which I have carried out for the last quarter of a century, established the generalization that the psychological mechanism of the plant is identical with that of an animal, Bose wrote. Now, this isn't entirely true. Plant cells are different from animal cells. They have cell walls and things like chloroplasts. Plus, plants simply don't have synapses. But Bose called it a generalization, and if we truly are generalizing, he seems right. Plant and animal bodies may be operating on similar basic principles, at least electrically speaking. I was hardly the first person to stumble back into Bose's plant experiments. The Secret Life of Plants, not to be confused with The Secret Life of Bees, had an entire chapter devoted to Bose, which was one of the first few parts of the book that later held up to scrutiny. The year the book was released in 1973, a young biologist named Elizabeth Van Valkenburg was fresh out of her undergraduate degree. She read The Secret Life on her breaks from her job as a technician at a botany lab in Duke University in North Carolina. The Bose chapter stood out to her. Soon, the idea of plant electricity came to dominate her thoughts. I'd first come across Van Valkenburg's name listed as the president of the Society for Plant Neurobiology, now toned down to the Society of Plant Signaling and Behavior, and saw that she'd studied the electrical impulses in sunflowers years ago. When I called her in 2018, she sounded surprised. Now, as a professor at the University of Washington, she couldn't get her mostly pre-medical students taking a required ecology elective to care all that much about plants, let alone about early research into why they had electrical currents running through them. She was leading a lab that studied how leaves expand. When I was calling to talk about plant electricity, a preoccupation of hers from years ago, back when she was still publishing papers on this stuff, back before the funding dried up, Van Valkenburg remembers 1973 vividly. She just graduated with a degree in plant biology. She'd chosen biology because her grades in every other area were worse. Her work in the Duke lab was mindless, It was her job to endlessly count leaves on experimental plants and measure their length and width ad nauseum. She wasn't sure what she wanted to do with her degree, but it wasn't it. This wasn't it. This, the measuring. Yeah, be your own measuring stick. On her break, she read The Secret Life of Plants. So she read Plants Had Electrical Lives. Why hadn't this ever come up in her undergraduate lectures? For one thing, Bose had an embarrassing period. He dedicated a portion of his career to questioning whether machines were alive. When his scientific instruments began to slow down after repeated use, he saw a parallel to fatigue in human nerves. The episode reminds me of Alexander Graham Bell, who invented one of the most important pieces of technology in the modern world, the telephone. But he was driven to do so by his belief that the static he could hear on the line was a message from dead people and might be coming from his dead brother. Bell wasn't expunged from the canon for that. Neither was Thomas Edison, whose lesser-known ideas included a belief in telepathy. Those parts of their biologies had simply slipped to the background. Of course, they were white men. Bose was dark-skinned and Indian. One botanist told me that his lost legacy is the product of point-blank American racism. In 1981, after Van Valkenburg got her PhD and was working as a postdoc in the University of Illinois, she began to experiment with plant electricity. She'd arrived to work on a completely different problem using corn plants, but her advisor had worked with action potentials and shown her how to measure them. She cut off a piece of corn leaf and hooked it up to a voltmeter, and then that beeped when current ran through it. Then she shone a light on the corn leaf. Its cells, still alive, could still photosynthesize. Photosynthesis is an inherently electrical process. The voltmeter went wild, beeping frantically. I was excited. There was something very elusive about electricity, she said. Electricity is invisible, but stick some probes in a plant and suddenly you get a signal on a screen. It's like, wow. It's almost like it's speaking to you. It feels alive. By 1983, she went back to the University of Washington, where in another building on the same campus at the same time, David Rhodes had just published his infamous experiments on the caterpillar invasion of the university forest. The news of the talking trees was getting around. Asterisk. 7 months later, another paper finding virtually the same thing in maples appeared in the journal Nature. Publication in Nature was a big deal. It confers weight. Shortly after, yet another paper found that the messages could be passed between different plant species. Wafts of chemicals released by a damaged sagebrush could prompt a nearby tomato plant to boost its defenses. Plant communication? In the lab hallways, Van Valkenburg and her colleagues wondered aloud if it could be real. If plants could communicate through airborne cues, could they do the same with electrical impulses? We know our own bodies are essentially electric. It is often forgotten that our present understanding of how electricity governs human nerves and muscles began in plants. The researchers Alan Lloyd Hodgkin, Andrew Fielding Huxley, and John Carew Eccles won a Nobel Prize for figuring out the electrical nature of human neurons in the 1950s. Their work was based on earlier studies in which scientists measured electrical impulses in the giant cells of char algae, a common pond weed. The chara cells were enormous, as cells go, 10 centimeters long and a millimeter in diameter, and thus conveniently visible to the naked eye. You could jab an electrode right into one, and they were excitable in much the same way as human cells are. It took a long time for science to begin to ask plants more electrical questions. In 1992, a group of researchers from the UK and New Zealand found that they could block the chemical signaling in tomato seedlings, but that the plants could still accumulate the defensive proteins without when another part of the plant was wounded. Interesting. Fascinating, really. But they also noted that when a seedling was intentionally wounded, a flurry of electrical activity was detectable. Could the defensive signal be sent by way of the electrical impulses, they wondered, instead of the chemical ones? In a letter published in Nature, the researchers even went so far as to say that the electrical activity had similarities to the epithelial conduction system used to transmit a stimulus and the defense responses of some lower animals. In epithelial conduction, an electrical signal is transported cell to cell by way of narrow channels that let ions pass between adjacent cells. Although plants lack any structures comparable to animal nerves, they wrote, cells in a plant tissue are linked by narrow threads that have electrical conductivities nearly identical to those in animal tissues. Could the signal to beef up defenses be passed this way? What would it mean? Their results provided the first definition. Excuse me, I'm like thinking too fast or reading too fast. I don't know which one it is. Their results provided the first definite evidence for a link between an electrical signal and a biochemical response in plants. Around the same time, Van Valkenburg felt she was closing in on something significant. First, she studied how cells expanded and how they led to growth in leaves. Then she published papers on how the outer membranes of cells reacted to different wavelengths of light, and the way in which that changed how a plant grew. The cell membrane, she thought, had a lot more going on than what was thought in a textbook. In animals, the cell membrane is what governs the flow of electricity. In 1993, 20 years after von Valkenburg began her graduate studies, another scientist finally realized what was going on with the cell membranes of plants. Botanist Barbara Pickard had been working on electricity in plants since the 1970s and was known to rely as much on her intuition as her data, to the chagrin of her fellow researchers. It's intuition. Which is interesting that they mentioned several of the researchers had like a history in believing in telepathy, especially the ones that developed the use of the telephone, or the one that was doing experiments on machines and thought that it was human-like. But she discovered a channel that led straight through the membrane with its own little gate. It was there to allow the flow of electrical current, essentially calcium ions, through the cells when something mechanically pushed on them, that is, when they were physically touched. Pickard and her team found the first definitive evidence of mechanosensitive ion channels in plants. For the first time, researchers had a way to look at how, at the cellular level, plants experience touch as a physical force from the inside. Back when I got here, no one believed plants had ion channels, Van Valkenburg said. Voltage-activated ion channels are the basis of nerves. The ions that caused action potentials in plants weren't the same as the ones in animal nerves, and the proteins that regulate them weren't the same either. But still, Van Valkenburg thought, you'd have to wonder if they have nerve-like functions. It was impossible to ignore the parallels between the two structures. If plants had nerve-like functions, that opened up a world of possibilities and new questions. Could they be said to feel, like emote emotions, emoji, feelings, getting your feels? The research from the UK and Australia 2 years earlier had circled around the same idea but hadn't quite touched it. Now there was proof of ion channels. By the way, there's an ions university that does similar experiences with similar experiments as these. I think more so on humans, but I think it's, just go look it up yourself if you're interested. This significant finding should have marked a turning point towards a illustrious career and would have amounted to a brand new field of research. But at that point, plant behavior was emaciating because of funding yet again. In 1995, then President Bill Clinton got word that the U.S. Department of Agriculture was funding studies on stress in plants with taxpayer money. He even made a jibe about it in that year's State of the Union address, implying that he thought the study was about plants needing psychotherapy and promised to cut such wasteful spending. Interesting. There's a book by Dan Brown, if Dan Brown is your cup of tea. And it's actually called Deception Point. And it's about the discovery of something deep below the Arctic ice in Antarctica, obviously. And the way that NASA and the government went about exploring it. And I do understand that, like, it's a nonfiction, so it's not factual. However, this kind of rings true, and like that The reaction from politics on scientific discovery or frontier seems to be hold true across many different fields of study. This general attitude morphed into added skepticism for researchers trying to push the envelope on plant physiology. Funding became harder to get. Pickard, who already raised the hackles of her colleagues by openly speaking her mind on deficiency in other people's work, further set herself apart by refusing to play the rules of grant writing. People felt that she overspoke, Van Valkenburg says, but she was way ahead of the game. She stopped publishing, was slowly ostracized by the field, and was forced to give up her lab. She spent the last decade of her career conducting her research out of someone else's lab. I'm going to stop here. This is page 87. Indeed, we started on page 80. So that's enough of that for a day. I'm going to use the plant deck. I'm going to use Nadia Turner Fairy Oracle deck. And I'm going to use the animal deck because I just find that the three probably have some type of interaction that will be entertaining. So if we're going to kind of recount what we just read, it's more or less figuring out the physiological. Let me get the plants first, actually. Let me do that. It's probably helpful to have at least a guiding point where we're talking about. Excuse me. Just had a coughing fit. The beginning of which you got to witness. My throat is like jacked up now. Completely jacked. No, it's not. It'll be fine in a moment. Literally, I sound like I just sucked helium. Sorry about that. I'm actually not sorry. Just so strange. Like I was just fine. I was just reading. I was just fine. Ooh, calendula just came out in the upright. The petals are edible and a good saffron substitute. Okay, well, my Bose speaker box doesn't want to work for this, but I'm gonna push through it. Gosh darn it. Yeah, so saffron is used to make like paella with rice. It says the petals are edible and a good saffron substitute. You've got hot peppers. Maybe that's why my throat was just like freaking out. I've shuffled this deck. The reading I did the other day, pages I think 75 to 80. Both of these cards came out there as well in a different order. You've got licorice in the reverse at number 3, which is number 5. Hot pepper says first cultivated in Central and South America around 3000 BC. And then licorice is its flavor can be used in not only candies but in soft drinks and herbal teas as well. That came out in the reverse and my throat suddenly feels way better. Maybe I need to drink a cup of licorice tea. That was just really strange. I'm really sorry. I don't understand sometimes. Channeling makes your physical body reflect sometimes some of the intricacies. So if we're talking about electrical impulses and the way that plants respond to pressure or touch, right? Actually, the other day I was talking with somebody about pascals. Pascals are a measure of pressure. However, it's also a name that they use commonly just as a name for things, like a pascal. In this specific case, it was a table. I wonder what kind of wood was used in that table. Honey agaric is coming out. Useful remedy for boosting your immune system. I'm going to get one more, then we'll take top of the read. What else can we get? Ooh, enokataki. Most commonly used in warm dishes like soups, stews, and stir-fried dishes. So just right off the bat, and at the bottom we've got cucumber, the cucumber plant. It says the phrase cool as a cucumber refers to its ability to cool your body temperature. So if we're looking at the fact that temperature could be associated with how quickly energy can move back and forth between something, when you are experiencing pain in a specific area, you may use a hot or cold compress to at least increase the blood flow or kind of decrease the swelling. I'm thinking of myself because, you know, good old jaw pain, that's what it feels like. Here it's like kind of like without things being too cool or too tepid in temperature, especially politically speaking. I think the understanding of plant life as having a response or feelings is what's important here. Um, the the other day when I was channeling, calendula came out as a calendar, right? And if we're talking about hot peppers, oh, excuse me, unless you're allergic to them, obviously it increases the heat quite a bit. And if this cucumber is in the reverse, this is the understanding of how quickly those transferences of electrical impulses can be made. At a different point in this book, which I've not read yet on camera, they do talk about the difference between the way that leaves above ground communicate and roots below ground communicate. And I think that's actually relevant here. Licorice in the reverse. Licorice root is actually where most of the, well, that I know of. I'm, yeah. Think what they mean when they say that the flavor, it actually comes from below ground. Whereas with tomatoes, obviously the pepper grows above ground, right? Then there are these two mushrooms, and I'm just looking here. These are the only two mushrooms that came out in this read, and they came out side by side, both in the upright. This is honey agaric, and this is enokataki. Okay, number 9 and number 3 in that order. Um, I don't know why, but I'm just kind of seeing that like there's a, if I'm gonna put these all together, cucumber grows above ground, but it's also cool, like a cooling effect, right? Licorice is below ground, it's the roots. There's something about the two coming together. There's a two, I'm just seeing two cups on a string, listening to, each other talk through cups on a string. That was like the childlike kind of interpretation of Bell and Edison, right? But then if we think about telepathy and the electrical impulses that are used in our own human brains, we'll just use the animal deck while we're doing this because maybe that'll, help illuminate some more of what is going on here. That's similar to the way that you've got to like break down the physiology of a plant. It would be similar to understanding whether the caterpillars chewing, the sound of caterpillars chewing is more or less damaging than the sound of beetles chewing at the root or something like that. There's a similar correlation. When I get to that point in the book that actually talks about that, I'll revisit this reading perhaps. But the time for hot and the time for cold is the same as the above ground and below ground. It's the two extremes having to be connected by a cord. So if you had these two cups, one here with the 3 and the 8, the calendula and the hot pepper, yeah, you could make spicy saffron with hot peppers. Or you could make a honey agaric and nokatake mushroom soup for yourself if you're trying to boost your immune system in a stir-fry dish or in a stew. Most commonly used in warm dishes like soups, stews, and stir-fry. There's a song stir-fry I really like, but anyway, I'm not going to go there. This is the dolphin coming out, and it's connecting both sides. If you see the above her head and below her head with this shell, actually. It is kind of like listening to the ocean. Are you really hearing the static? Is that what they were hearing, was the static, which is dead people talking? Are you really hearing the ocean when you listen to the inside of a shell, or is it just the white noise in the air being reflected back onto your ear? I don't know why the cochlear, I think this is a conch shell. It might not be. Don't take my word for it. But I think conch shells are the ones that you can really listen to. And you have, if you've ever seen somebody who has a cochlear implant, or there's cochlear hairs on the inside of your ear that are very sensitive, and when they move, that's what allows you to hear. Part of the life of plant. Okay, there you go. It's the Bose speaker box to the earphone. It's the Bluetooth connection between the two, would be the electrical impulses in the air. Yeah, it's kind of time to realize that there might be intuition that goes into a lot more living beings than just humans, that animal life or whatever floats through the air, that's probably why I'm choking, is on something that's floating through the air. I don't know why I heard flying through the air on a flying trapeze just now, but that's kind of what it is. It's understanding the medicinal, the spiritual, as well as the electrical possibilities that exist not only outside your body, but inside your body. Same thing for plants. And once we can actually establish those connections, then intuitively speaking, it gives you a view, or like kind of a better vision, a better well-honed vision of what exactly is cooling off, what's heating up, and what needs to be addressed in terms of immuno support. As if we were to think about the body of work surrounding plants as the body that needs the immune system, right? That needs the support in that way, the immune support. Here's the fish. I'm seeing a lot of water coming out here. Dolphins and fish. Let me see what comes out for this third portion of the reading. Something fell on the ground. Okay, I don't really want to take these because they just fell. I'll tell you what they are, just out of curiosity. Animal deities is the one that stayed in my hand. Okay, actually, this is interesting. This is above the table, right? On the table right now is animal deities. That's something that you can tap into. It's the animal life, just like it's plant life. Okay, and that's the third. This is 9-3. This is the third group that we have here. Grouping, excuse me. So if we're talking about two sides of a phone call, then we've got these kind of the yin and the yang over here. We've got this, groups of fish. You can travel in a gaggle of geese. You can travel in a swarm of bees. You can travel in, you understand what I mean? Every animal deity, a pack of wolves. You can travel in many different ways. Electricity travels in many different ways also, obviously, through water, through the air, through the earth, molten hot lava. The snake is what fell on the floor. So snake is, ironically, that's Gnosticism for me automatically. It is not something that is associated with temperature, but it's kind of like playing a game of hot and cold. It fell directly on top of animal deities, so I'm going to see what this is. The pelican. Oh. Interesting. That's airborne. That's the only airborne animal that we've seen. Let me just... Wisdom, focus, self-sacrifice, and nurture. Okay, it really wanted to be on the table. You saw it pop out of my hand like that. And at the bottom of the deck, we've got the polar bear. So I do feel like that goes with cool as a cucumber up here as the bottom of the reading. The polar bear. And I think if you were to think about the extremes, the water being frozen, or the water being made into snow or sleet or hail for that matter, being cool as a cucumber doesn't really help us to understand the electrical impulses that cause that to happen in the clouds, right? Same goes for plant life on Earth. So if you think about the surrounding environment of calendula or hot peppers, they may do well with, having more of a in between, like a both in between. I'm just seeing like this, come see, come so. Oh, come, like come see, come so. This is like these are the these are the cups, right? This is a cup. There's a cup. There's the wire. Is the shell, if you know what I'm talking about. That's really the connection. It's the string that is string theory, right? And if we were to think about that for licorice, same thing goes. It's actually the depth of the licorice root that gives us the medicinal part of the plant. This is in the reverse. It came out in the reverse, but this fish was in the upright. So it's kind of telling us this is a submerged medicinal use. That's how I'm reading it. Then here with this immune system and being used in all these different dishes, warm dishes for that matter. If we were to experience global warming, it would affect all of these animals, all of the animals really, all animal deities. Animal deities in specific is divinity, guidance, and wisdom. And if you think about like the way that these mushrooms, I'm not promoting any type of drug use. However, even in, human mammals, mushrooms can give you quite the experience if you have an understanding of the way they interact with the immune system, with your digestive system. And all of the animals are listed here. Like this is the whole animal kingdom. The entire animal kingdom is right here. Then you've got this coolness that goes about what's on the outside, what's on the inside. I do just want to say that the skin of a polar bear is black. Not that that matters, but since they were talking just briefly about racism, this would be the most confusing animal ever because it looks white to the naked eye, obviously. But really, if you were to shave all the skin off a polar bear, it's black. So, pelican and snake just kind of talks about this secret life, or they're talking about the secret life of trees. I almost said bees again, but that's the knowledge that is to be taken away from or added to the animal realm, the deities that preside there. Yeah, interesting. Gonna put that there. So we've got I'm kind of keeping these over here because, like I said, they flew on one on top of the table, one underneath. So it is relevant. However, the relevance has much more to do with, like, yes, the moon is here. So is the shadow of the moon up there. Here in like the like snakes in the grass kind of energy is more of a weaving together, the coming together of the two sides, the cups. It's understanding whether you're hearing communication and being able to discern between the two. So same thing with the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. We'll just call it that. Plant kingdom, animal kingdom. Yeah, I think that's more or less the spiritual takeaway that I'm going to take from it, at least. I'm going to use Nadia Turner's Fairy Oracle deck to get some Nadia Turner advice. These are the Hedge Guardians. They're coming out in the reverse here. It says, walk widdershins and seek the land under the hill. I think that's what this meant, is that calendula and hot pepper are above ground. I was telling you, like, the listening to a shell while also hearing the squealing or the squeaks, the clicks. They actually talk about the clicks of plants. Dolphins also have clicks. They communicate with clicks. So do humans that work in, the Navy or the Marines, maybe. I don't know. I don't know. There was something briefly about, like, lieutenant, sergeant, colonel, major, like, coming, like, ranking coming through at the last reading also. Pages 75 to 80, I believe it was. If that's relevant to your life, then maybe go watch that one if you want to. Yeah, the Thimble Witch has come out second. There is magic in beginnings, so start something new. The licorice root being in the reverse with that, it kind of, like, too much licorice can mess with your heart rate. But it's also kind of a treat, if you know what I mean. Like, there are some stores that actually sell raw licorice root that you can chew on, kind of like you're chewing on a twig or a stick. And it's not something that very many people would know about. They think about black or red licorice. In this specific case, I feel like the Thimble Witch is the one that would know how to find the root of an issue or of a problem that could be kind of a sweet outcome, or like the sweets. I don't know why I'm just fishing for a sweet outcome. I'm remembering the woman in the book who had to actually measure the leaves and count how many there were on each stalk. It sounds like a tedious job, but also knowing, like, if ever there was, like, a zombie apocalypse that happened, the Thimble Witch is the one that you'd want to be best friends with. She would know which mushrooms are going to send you on a trip, which ones are nutritious for your body, and which ones will just flat out kill you and poison you. Something that the animal deities probably inherently know. They kind of just automatically know what kills them or not. Like a cat, right? Stray cats and dogs, they have to know when they sniff something whether or not they're able to eat it or digest it. So there's got to be an electrical impulse that tells them that. It notifies them. And the Thimble Witch is the one with that kind of knowledge. She's that fairy. Strange Journeys with an S. I feel like it says take control of your quest, choose your companions wisely. This is saying like there's so many companions that you could choose. There's literally plenty of fish. Okay, if that's the way that we're gonna look at this, right? There's an entire world of mushrooms. We could just only look at mushrooms. If we're gonna only look at mushrooms, that's like a whole different book. If we were gonna only look at tree life, if we were only gonna look at shrub life, if we were only gonna look like at bush life, if we're only gonna look at moss, algae, fungus, like there's so many different subsets of plant that could be studied. This is what that they mean in my book, at least. Be wise about it, but also don't limit yourself. Just that's the wisdom of the plant deities, is knowing which ones to pursue and which ones not to pursue. Plain and simple. Simple and plain. Okay. The Sentinel came out. I'm going to put the Sentinel with these two that were under the table and over the table. You either are smelling something above ground or below ground. It's a intuitively, if we're talking about the synapses, quote unquote, or the feelings of plants, this is knowing whether they're subverted or whether you are overtly picking up on them. It's the magic of, yeah, I just said animal deities. The magic of animals is that they've got to know their own self inside enough to know what they can consume on the outside. The Sentinel's similar looking to the Sphinx, not gonna lie. Similar looking, they're not the same thing. However, we're gonna talk about snakes, Gnosticism, and the whole secrets of animal deity life, as it were. There you go. So for cucumber and the polar bear, the gnome of mushrooms and buttons has come out. Seek silliness and joy, they are wise teachers. This came out in the upright. Yeah. Silliness and joy don't have anything to do with what you're looking at. It doesn't have to do with what you're hearing. It has to do with keeping a jovial, youthful outlook on yourself and others, rather than being so critical or rather than inciting doubt. So you know how they were talking about the funding left after there were political statements made and blah, blah, blah. It's all very adult, okay? All very adult. All very adult-like to just have an opinion and speak it. That's great, right? However, in this specific case, that's the point, is that animals have to learn how to survive, but that's not all they do. You can see animals playing all over the place. You can see squirrels chasing each other. You can watch the same thing in the jungle. You can watch the same thing in Antarctica. I mean, with the baby seals or the penguins sliding down the rivulets, right? Or the snow piles or whatever the case may be. That's the point. This is the troll fae. I don't know why I just pulled this one also, because I've already got the bottom of the deck with the cucumber. Cool as a cucumber. The polar bear and the gnome of mushrooms and buttons. But the troll fae says, follow the secret signs, as treasures can be found where you least expect them. I think that's the point. That's what I was trying to verbalize, not doing a very good job. This is the wisdom of understanding your surroundings, and especially when it comes to nature. So, this is really long. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Sorry. Squeeze me. I saw you, okay? Hopefully it was helpful.